Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Teaching English webinar series for teacher educators. This month, we are hosting a special review webinar where we will reflect on the key themes and ideas from our Teaching English webinars for teacher educators. My name is Shirin Soyuz, and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you very much for joining us for this live session. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping reminders. While we are waiting to get started, please introduce yourself in the Q&A. Tell us where you are joining from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, please type pre-service. If you work in in-service teacher education, please type in-service. You will have a chance to ask questions during the session. Please use the Q&A function to ask us your questions. We'll use the chat for announcements. And the link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive in the next couple of days. And finally, this session is being recorded and the webinar recording will be available on our Teaching English website in the next couple of days. So let me introduce our guests for today. First of all, yes, as you know, this is the British Council team behind the webinar. So Graham Stanley is the British Council's teacher development team based in the UK. He holds an M.Ed in ELT and educational technology from the University of Manchester and has extensive experience in teacher development. He's also the editor of Innovations in Education Remote Teaching publication. Hi, Graham. And we also have Ellen Darling, is Senior Manager for Research and Insights in English Language Teaching at the British Council. She has over 30 years of international experience as a teacher educator and self-assessor, author and editor. Based in Italy, she has worked with learners, teachers in Spain, Colombia, Egypt, Morocco, and Qatar. And her interests include young learners, continuing professional development, and teacher education. And I'm Shirin Soyuz. I'm based in Istanbul, Turkey, and I work as a teacher educator, and I'm also a researcher, and I manage the teacher educator community network and the webinars for the British Council. And my work focuses on e-learning, research mentoring, and community building for professional development. So we will be reviewing the webinars, and before we actually start reviewing, to begin, I would like to invite Ellen to help us set the scene. So Ellen will start us by sharing some reflections on why this kind of review is important. So over to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Shirin. Thanks for the introduction to us all. So I just wanted to say a few words about the importance of review. So in our professional development, it's very easy to move from one session to the next. What's the next topic? Who's the next speaker? What are the new ideas? Without really stopping to consolidate learning. But actually, this is the really important moment. When you pause, when you review, that's when deeper professional development can happen. So in this webinar today, we're not just recapping what's been presented, but we're using it as an opportunity to make meaning out of what we've learnt and experienced. So my first point about this is that it will help us to identify key learning from the year. Across all the webinars you've attended, there will be certain ideas that have stayed with you, perhaps a concept, perhaps a framework, perhaps a strategy or a question that challenged your thinking. So just take a moment now to think, what's one idea from this year's webinars or other input you've received that you still remember clearly? I'll give you a few seconds to have a think. One idea from the webinars or from input you've received that you still remember clearly. Because the fact that that's stayed with you probably means it has some significance for you and for your practice. My second point is about relevance and application. As teacher educators, we're constantly bridging theory and practice, both for ourselves and for the teachers we work with. So a quick key question here is, which of these ideas have you actually been able to use? And perhaps more importantly, or equally importantly, which ones have you not used? And why is that? Sometimes the gap between input and application tells us something. It might be that the idea is not relevant or to us in our context, or it might be that it's an area where we need further support or exploration to be able to really put it into practice properly. The third point is about making connections between topics. Webinars can sometimes feel quite fragmented and one-off experiences, so it's useful to look for patterns and links between themes. And it's when we step back, we often start to see those patterns. So as we talk through this review, consider what connections are you starting to see across the different webinars? This is where our understanding can become more coherent and more powerful. Today, you'll see that we've grouped the webinars together where we feel there are similarities and overlaps in topic. The fourth point is about professional dialogue and the importance of talking to our colleagues. Reviewing doesn't have to be a solitary activity. In fact, it's often much richer when we share perspectives. Different people notice different things. What stood out to you might not be what stood out to someone else. So these moments of reflection are also opportunities to ask, what did others take from this? Or what did I miss? And this kind of dialogue, which we're going to be modelling for you today with our colleagues at the British Council, they're at the heart of teacher-educator development. So we're not just consuming input, but we're building it, we're constructing it, we're interpreting it together. And finally, my last point is about informing future professional development. Review is about looking back, but it's also about how that looking back can influence looking forward. When you reflect on the year as a whole, you start to see patterns in your learning. Areas where you feel more confident, areas where you're still uncertain, and areas where you'd like to go deeper. So a key question here is, what do you want to learn next? Because effective CPD is not just delivered, it's shaped by our evolving discussions, evolving needs, and in our professional life, it's shaped by what we have reviewed and what we want to plan. Okay, those are my thoughts on why review is important. I think it's back over to you, Shirin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ellen. I also would like to give a quick overview of what will happen today. After this understanding of why review is important, we would also like to model, as Ellen mentioned, because we will be looking back the webinars from the past year. And we had 12 webinars in total, and all these webinars are on our Teaching English website under webinars for teacher educators. And for today, we have grouped them into 4 themes, and we'll go through each group together. And after each one, we will pause to hear your questions and reflections. But we would also like to encourage you to go back to these recordings on your own, together with the CPD group in your school, university, or with the teachers that you work together. You can also take these groups or look at them in different ways and review them also, watch the recordings. We would like to encourage you to do that. So if we start with this first group, the first group was professional engagement and collaboration webinars. And so we have 3 webinars here, focusing on mentoring. 2 of them are focusing on mentoring and 1 on the role of teaching assistants. And I'd like to start by briefly reflecting on the mentoring webinars. So I'm a mentor myself. I'm mostly mentoring teacher research, but what I found particularly interesting about these sessions is that how mentoring is presented as a skilled professional relationship. So it's not all about telling someone what to do, but it's relational and developmental. So it's also about mentors' professional development. So it's mutual relationship between mentee and the mentor. And there are lots of range of competencies, of course, for the mentors, which are mentioned in the webinars, but also challenges. So, for example, knowing when to guide and when to step back and avoiding the temptation to give quick solutions. And the second webinar, Nelson's webinar, was mostly about mentor talk and feedback. So it should be purposeful. Feedback should be more dialogic. So two-way conversation, but sometimes it can be also directive, sometimes more collaborative, depending on the context and the mentee's needs. I think these 2 webinars on mentoring was great for me to have an overview of the expectations from a mentor, from a mentee, and the kinds of relationship, and how the process of this reflection, encouraging dialogue and professional growth for both sides. So, and I'm curious to hear your perspectives as well. What stood out to you in these sessions, or anything else you would like to add, Ellen, Graham?
I can start if you like, just jumping in there. Sorry, Ellen, about the mentoring webinars. What I think was quite interesting is that we had two webinars that focus on mentoring. One of them giving an experienced mentor's approach and thoughts and knowledge. That's Nelson's, which I thought was really interesting to hear. The idea of using mentoring for professional development from his perspective. And then what I thought was really interesting is that we have this course that a number of teacher educators participated in, or rather in a course, community of practice. And that was very much kind of more of a crowdsourced approach to mentoring, with a lot of people's ideas being put in. So the two of them gave very contrasting but very interesting information. I don't know about you, Ellen. Did you find the teaching assistant webinar of interest, perhaps?
I did find the teaching assistant, the role of the teaching assistant webinar very interesting, because there were several things that struck me about this webinar. One important thing was that who trains the teaching assistants? So how much training do they get? Where does the training happen? It seems to be often on the job. And so I think the relationship between the teacher and the teaching assistant has to be developed, and possibly this could be an opportunity where there is mentoring opportunities between teacher and teaching assistant. But what does that say for us about the teacher educator? Because the teacher educator's got to sort of help guide teachers and teaching assistants in how to manage this relationship. And so I thought that was really interesting, that there's an opportunity there for mentoring to take place within the teacher assistant relationship. I'm not sure always in which direction. I think it could often be that the teaching assistant has a different view of the classroom and what's happening within the classroom. Maybe they're working with learners with special needs, and so they can give the teacher a different perspective on what's happening in the classroom. One of the things that came out from the webinar was that many teaching assistants feel that they are undervalued compared to the teacher in the classroom, and that people don't really realise how much they do and how important a role they have within the classroom. So I think as teacher educators, we need to think about how to raise awareness with teachers of the importance of, how much a teaching assistant can contribute to planning, can contribute to reflecting and making decisions about what to do in the classroom. And I think a key role for the teacher educator is how do we help teachers to manage that relationship? Because teachers often receive training on how to manage a classroom, but not necessarily on how to manage other colleagues within the educational team. But I think it's really important to recognise the professional value of teaching assistants and how much they can help make the learning in the classroom run so much more smoothly.
Yes, definitely. I think that's a good point. And I like the way that you made the link between mentoring and teaching assistants as well. Very, very good, Ellen. I'd like to ask, while we're waiting for questions from the audience, and please put any questions or comments that you want to make into the Q&A session if you're listening live, watching live. But a question I would like to ask both you, Ellen, and you, Shirin, that I'm interested in knowing is, have either of you worked with a teaching assistant or have either of you been a teaching assistant? I have to say, in my experience, I don't have experience of either working with a teaching assistant or being a teaching assistant, but I wondered if either of you have.
I've observed the teaching assistants. So when I was doing my postgraduate certificate in education, in primary education, in my placement, I was in a classroom with the main teacher and also saw how the teaching assistant was really put to good use to help, particularly with learners who were not following necessarily the same curriculum as the main classroom. So the teaching assistant would take out, she had a couple of learners that she was supporting at a different level because they weren't really able to access the actual mainstream curriculum. So that was really interesting for me. That was in a primary school, and I really saw how important it was to know how to use that assistant to the best of their abilities, and to be able to guide them, but also to listen to them, to get feedback from them about what they were saying about the progress of the learners that she was working with.
Interesting. What about you, Sharon? Have you had much of or any experience of teacher being or working with teacher assistants?
No, it's not something we have in my country. I mean, it would be really helpful, but it needs to be managed really well. So as we have also learned from Ahamefuna about the kinds of tensions that could arise between the teaching assistants, between the teacher and the role of the teacher educator. But yes, for me, I haven't really experienced it. But it's something that is needed, I think, that could be very beneficial for both teaching assistants, potential teaching assistants who could be retired people or who could be newly qualified teachers who need more experience. But yes, it's a delicate topic, and that needs to be really handled carefully with planning and training, or I don't know. Hamefuna explained everything so clearly, so I would really like to encourage everyone to watch that recording. It was eye-opening for me.
Yes, of course. We have a comment that I found is interesting that you might want to reflect upon. Teacher assistants are essential to model activities and avoid L1 use. I think that's quite an interesting thing. I think it's clear to me that the teaching assistant can be put to use by the teacher when it comes to modeling, especially if it's a dialogue or a role play situation, which I think is interesting. But what about avoiding L1 use? I don't know how that would be done in particular, or was that in the webinar? I can't remember.
I don't think that was in the webinar. I guess teaching assistants can be quite useful as in they're sitting with the learners. So like if the teacher is sort of delivering an instruction and the learners, there are some learners who don't understand what's going on, they can intervene, I guess, quite easily because they are seeing the classroom from where the learners are sitting and they're among the learners.
That was also my understanding, especially with helping learners with special needs. So that was mostly mentioned.
And there's a comment from Ivalo that Ivalo worked in China and said the Chinese teaching assistant that Ivalo had actually helped with the translation into Chinese when necessary, which of course is interesting if you don't speak the local language. To have a teaching assistant who does can be very useful.
Mm-hmm.
What about, before we move on, just very briefly, when it comes to mentoring, have either of you been a mentor or have been mentored? I don't think we have a lot of time to talk about this before we move on to the next section, but if you can briefly say perhaps that one important thing that you got from being either a mentor or being mentored. mentored, sorry.
I haven't been, so I can't answer that question.
Good.
Yes, I have been a mentor and I have been mentored recently. So, because I was also part of the How to Mentor community of practice. So some of our colleagues presented in the Art of Mentoring webinar. So I was part of that community of practice and I actually experienced mentoring, being mentored as well. So yeah, patience was the key word for me we need to be really, we need to be flexible, we need to be purposeful, dialogic. So everything that has been mentioned in the webinar, actually, I have experienced myself. And I'm really very grateful for the opportunity of having a mentor during the duration of this community of practice, and I can answer any questions you have about mentoring. My experience of being mentored.
Excellent. I have to guiltily admit that I started in that group on demand, the community of practice, but it was so busy recently that I wasn't able to participate as much as I wanted to or said I would. So, which is a real shame because mentoring is something that is very, very close to me. I've been mentored and I have mentored people myself, and all the opportunities that I've had to do that have been very rewarding. And actually, what I found really interesting the first time I was a mentor to someone is that I probably learned and experienced and got so much from it myself, perhaps as much as the mentee did, or perhaps even more, I think, through the process of doing it. So I learned not just the process of learning about mentoring through doing it, but actually learning a lot about other things as well, which I didn't expect to happen. So I recommend it, definitely. It's a fabulous way of teacher development.
Yeah, so it's just, as you say, mutual, and there are some positive side effects you never know. Those human skills.
So, Ellen, we need to encourage you to be mentored or to be a mentor to someone, I think.
That will be in my plan for professional development for next year.
Fantastic. Should we hand over to you, Ellen, for the next set of webinars to talk through them?
Sure, yeah. Okay, so the next set of webinars, there's two in this particular section. So digital and innovative practice webinars. And here we're looking at becoming an e-moderator and also human and artificial intelligence, a collaborative partnership. So Graham and Shirin, what were your thoughts on either of these two interesting topics?
Okay, let me start with the first one, Becoming an E-Moderator by Julie Salmon. So an E-Moderator is like an online teacher, tutor, online teacher educator in our case. We learned all these being an E-Moderator, online tutor from Julie Salmon a long, long time ago. We started with his books and his 5-stage model. So it was really great to have her with us in our webinars, to see her, to hear from her on this e-moderation skills. And what was very interesting for me, some keywords that she used, some phrases. For example, she said that technology itself doesn't create learning, but design and facilitation do. So she highlighted that. So she mentioned, for example, facilitation is human and pedagogical, and smart teacher educators design learning once and deliver it many times. So she highlighted the importance of instructional design and intentional design. So and the fact that effective online learning depends on skilled facilitation and pedagogical design than on the tools we use. She also introduced this 5-stage model and the importance of structured progression and activities, which are e-learning activities that guide learners step by step. So we mainly discussed the importance of purposefulness, the importance of having a well-designed the course and the importance of planning. And she also mentioned how AI can be used meaningfully, how it can help with administrative tasks, summarizing discussions. But this actually makes the role of teacher educator more important, because AI can organize information, but it cannot really fully understand the context or emotions or learners' needs. So our role shifts towards more maybe making those instructional decisions and supporting learners with the help of AI. So that was my understanding.
Fantastic. What I think is really interesting is that Elise Salmon's sort of theories still hold up, especially relevant today to being an e-moderator when they were first developed, when basically e-moderation was just with chat, with text chat. And I remember doing an e-moderating course when that was the case, when it wasn't possible to actually mainly come together to use voice to do this, which I think is quite interesting. But for me, the second webinar, if I can talk briefly about that, I think I found particularly interesting. And this was all about exploring how teacher educators can use artificial intelligence to engage more effectively with academic research. And what I thought was interesting about this webinar was not only the subject, which I'm particularly interested in, but also the fact that we didn't have just one point of view, but a number of speakers, each with their own background and take on AI. And I think that's when you have this kind of subject that is quite new and quite controversial to a certain extent. I think you can really benefit from having a number of different people, to having a panel to talk through it. And you can see then at the end a kind of very considered argument emerging from that discussion. So in this case, we had you, Shirin, of course, bringing point of view of both working as a teacher educator and training teacher educators, as well as being involved in AI research. And then we had Danielle Cherry, Gary Mottram, and Susan Dawson, who all work with teacher educators in a university setting. And then finally, Nick Peachy, who had a wide range of knowledge and expertise relating to the AI tools and pedagogy of using them in a variety of settings. And I think if I were to summarize what went on there, I think first of all, there was the 4 essential competencies that were introduced and discussed, which are analytical thinking, creative thinking, inquisitiveness, and evidence-based thinking, which when it comes to AI, if they're used when it comes to research, it should ensure a critical partnership with the actual technology. And then there was a practical context introduced by Gary and Susan, who talked about the shifts in English language teaching over the last decade, and the report that they undertook related to and gave the background to our refreshing the CPD framework for teachers. And then finally, Nick, I think, demonstrated specific AI tools and techniques such as automated summarization and Socratic mentoring that can help teacher educators process, or researchers indeed, to process complex documents. And that last thing, I think, the Socratic mentoring using AI as a collaborative and interactive approach, I thought was really interesting. So this idea of using a tool such as Notebook LM, which is free from Google, to kind of collate the research together and then to start an interactive dialogue and allowing this questioning and modeling critical questions, so you can have good questioning techniques, was discussed in the webinar. And then interrogating the AI, who acts as if they were, to act as a questioning partner, really. Then really sort of looking at it from a critical viewpoint, I think, was the thing that I most got out of this webinar, and the risks there, of course, that exist of cognitive offloading and hallucinating by the AI, which I think are very important things to focus upon. I really recommend that any teacher educators who are involved or interested in research go back and revisit the webinar, or to have a look for the first time if it's new to you. To really, you'll really get a lot out of it, I think.
Yeah, I don't know what I feel about human and artificial intelligence and their partnership. I think for me, I'm really keen on AI. I love using AI and I find it quite motivating, but I am worried that people are going to use it as a default instead of using their own brains and applying their own knowledge and context. So I feel like for me, that's a question that I need to explore further is, I know how to plan a lesson. And I've been through all that process and training. But teachers coming up now, new teachers, how is the use of AI affecting their actual sort of ability and critical thinking skills to be able to use AI effectively and in the right way without getting deceived by hallucinations or by bad advice from AI, who, doesn't have ears and eyes and a body to experience being in a classroom.
Not yet, Ellen, but just give it a couple of years. But I think you're absolutely right to be worried or concerned about this, and I think that's why it's so important to involve teachers in teacher education about the use of AI. I think it's so important because a busy teacher, I think, can be tempted to use AI to cognitively offload, as was talked about in the webinar, to actually get the AI just to do the lesson planning, the marking, the rubric creation, the task setting, everything else. And I think there's a great danger in that, is that if you want to avoid AI taking over the teacher's job, then we need to make sure that we don't help AI to actually do that, and we actually give ourselves a role. And the same is true of teacher education, of course. So I think for me, teacher education has a big role in this, because as AI tools are being used more and more by teachers, we need to adopt the role of ensuring that teachers are using them critically and not for everything, and only really having that human in the loop, which is a phrase that's used a lot, in order to make sure that whatever we are allowing AI to do, and we're at the moment where it's important now, because this is the moment when we can affect what it does and how it's used in education. Whatever we allow them to do is being used to assist and augment the value of a teacher or teacher educator, and the human aspect of things, rather than just letting it do it without us really thinking about the effects of that. That's how I think as well, at least.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Shirin, yeah.
Susan also made something interesting during the webinar. If you remember, she was reflecting. They reflected on the report and how the report was analyzed by AI, or no, how AI reflected on the report itself. So Susan made a comment about AI's language, how it's being superlative, like the how AI identified the most important information from the report was different from how they identified as human beings. So it was very interesting. So we should also be cautious about the summaries from AI, because it can be different from how we interpret the facts in a report or in a particular context. But we should also they were encouraging us to follow up with AI with questions, so not just having one chain of thought, but having a conversation with AI. And they were also suggesting AI can facilitate and model good questioning, but we should stop being nostalgic about past, because it's not a tool anymore. It's part of education now. Learners are using it, and it's affecting how we think. So we need to stop this cognitive offloading, and as you say, get our hands dirty with it, but be cautious as we are learning how to use it.
Okay, I'm going to move on to some of the questions. There's been quite a lot of comments, as you can imagine, about these two particular webinars in this theme. But I thought one that was really interesting and combined both themes. It was a question from, no, can't see who it was a question from, but the question is, what are your thoughts on the possibility of AI being the teacher or the e-moderator?
I'll jump in there if you like. I'm sure, Surin, you have a lot to say about this as well. But yeah, I think it will be tried. It will. In fact, I think that there are instances of teaching being done by AI, or e-moderating being done by AI at the moment. So it is something that is will happen. Whether or not it's successful, I think, remains to be seen. I would like to think that, as I said before, I think there's sort of two ways to approach this. With all technology, you can talk about technology as a tool or technology as the tutor. And I think where AI is has real interest is when it's used as a tool. So when it's used by a human teacher to do certain things, or being used in that way, it's of much greater value than when it's used as a tutor. In other words, to teach. At least that's what I think is the most interesting way of using it. I don't know about you, Sharon.
I think mostly it will be like a hybrid way of using AI, not replacing it fully, but for us, it can be a tool to do some administrative tasks or to help with some certain aspects of teaching. Then teachers can have more time for the creative aspects. Here, I think what we need to remember, the context is missing in AI. So AI can never know our context. So we know the context, we know the people that we are working with. I think it will, it can never be the teacher, the e-moderator, but it can replace some tasks, definitely. Or it can be an assistant. At least this is what I would like to see in the future, as a role of AI. So rather than taking over our roles, because it's not, I mean, it can never replace the role of the teacher, of course, in the classroom, but it can definitely help with generating content with supervision of the teacher. So the teacher is the owner of the knowledge being created. So it's about how we use it, actually. It's about how we integrate it.
Yeah. Gar has I think, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, which is, what accent would the AI teach in?
I think what's interesting when it comes to AI, and text to speech and speech to text, I've been looking, because I'm from the northeast of England, and the accent there, the Geordie accent, doesn't seem to be well represented when it comes to AI, either when it comes to generating voices. I was looking at generating text to speech, and I was trying my hardest to find a Geordie accent to be able to do that for a personal project, not for an educational project, and I couldn't find one. And then the other thing I found quite interesting is sometimes the strong accents I'm just talking about UK regional accents, but I'm sure the same is true across the world. AI still has quite a lot of difficulty interpreting a lot of the of that and turning it into text.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm sure it's developing all the time.
There was also one comment from one of our team moderators. So there more and more now there's an interesting trend. She says that she has noticed in the last year projects tend to include some face-to-face components to add to e-learning. So this is also growing after the pandemic, I think. In addition to AI's growing, so face-to-face components are also needed more than ever, maybe in the future. This human element or human generated content maybe will be very valuable, I hope, in the future. So in addition to this, using AI as a shortcut is going to maybe outdated, then human generated content will be more important and more valuable, I hope.
Yeah.
Well, let's end that section on an optimistic tone then and move on to the next set of webinars.
Okay. So the next set of webinars are about professional knowledge and learner-centered pedagogy webinars. So we had 3 webinars. All of them were all different webinars, touched upon some really interesting topics. The first one was about promoting intentional dialogue in the classroom. So this is about oracy. It was very interesting for me because it was the first time for me to know more about this framework. And the second one was about bringing today's world into the classroom. This was about gaming, the world of gaming and what we should know as teacher educators so that we can guide our teachers. And the third one was empowering teachers to introduce art-based translanguaging practices. So all of them were all new, very innovative topics in the world of English language teaching to me. And yeah, I can briefly talk about the first one, intentional dialogue. So what I remember from this session is that dialogue needs to be intentional. It just doesn't happen on its own. And it needs to be part of design. Again, design element came up. So oracy is about giving students a choice. And this can only happen through the design. So by including sentence stems, discussion prompts, learning questions. So we can create a space for learners to take the lead and develop their thinking. And this also, there was an emphasis on inquiry-based learning through small group dialogic interactions, open-ended questions, so we can encourage learners to think more deeply and express their opinion. So in that case, the teacher intentionally needs to say less so that learners can say more. This was the message Naomi shared. So we need to move from delivering content to facilitating content, and this helps improve learners' identity. So the session was all about, having this design element in place through that intentional, well-planned dialogue. So it was such a nice session for me that that was an aha moment for me. Then I started including more dialogic prompts, learning questions. So I keep this in mind when I design my lessons. So I'm really grateful for this session. What about you? Do you remember any other sessions? Have you seen what's stayed with you as a result of attending these webinars?
Yeah, definitely. With me, I was most interested in the second of the webinars, this bringing today's world into the classroom, and that's because using gaming in language learning and teaching has been a special interest of mine for years, actually. And I was always a bit disappointed that not more people or even academics seem to sort of pick it up as a subject to explore more in. Although there has been on the sidelines a lot going on. I think I was expecting it years ago to take a more sort of central role. So it was great to see that the Professor Anna Maria Pinta and Dr. Helen Sherwin and their project Gaming in the Wild, which was investigating this, how children aged, I think, 8 to 14 learn English through online video games outside of school. So this incidental learning, because I think this is quite an important factor with many children nowadays, that a lot of computer games such as Minecraft and Roblox actually provide a lot of linguistic input and benefits and authentic language use, either within the game, or you find a lot of children across the world are playing these games and communicating in English with a lot of other gamers, which I think is fascinating. So there's a lot of non-school based grammar and communication going on in gaming environments. And this was looked at in the context in the webinar, encouraging teacher educators to actually play a role in helping teachers understand the distinction between, to help teachers understand this is happening, but also then to look at the distinction, which is another thing that came up in the webinar, between research and pedagogical approaches. So moving from research on or about children, which is something that is often done by researchers or in teacher education, to research with children, to give them agency and control over the process as well. And this idea of the real world English that is going on. So quite often it's important for teacher educators to help teachers and highlight the fact that there's a lot of real world English going on, especially when it comes to younger people, that they use while gaming, but not only gaming, TV, etc., which is more better known, I think. But when it comes to gaming, perhaps not as well known. And what I thought was quite interesting is that during the webinar, there were several sort of specific activities that were suggested by the two presenters about how teacher educators can implement them in training sessions. So using, for example, or just suggesting teachers actually find out what games children play to understand how they play them, and increasing the knowledge about the children in your classroom and how they're using English, and kind of opening your viewpoint to understanding that perhaps these children are actually using English to a certain extent on their own outside of the English classroom, not particularly because they want to study or practice English, but because they want to communicate with other people. And the only way they can do it sometimes is via English. I think that's quite interesting. And then there were some ideas about setting up gaming stations, and looking at the learning value of this, which I think is a good thing for teacher educators to have a look at in that webinar, and thinking about how course books or the syllabus can be adapted to include gaming, for example, if it's of interest. So adapting resources based on the interests of learners is something that I think teacher educators can really help teachers with. And then when it came to low-tech solutions, you can actually use images from a game, for example, and use those, or just talk about the actual gaming that's going on. So I think this was all very good advice, very interesting. This review has taught me to kind of like maybe go back and have a look at that webinar again, to watch it again and pick up some of the ideas that perhaps I missed the first time around. So I think I'll definitely be doing that. And then, of course, one of the things that was brought up, that teachers or teacher educators perhaps would be the reason why they don't pay much attention to this type of thing is if they're not gamers themselves. So I think one of the things you can definitely do, and which was spoken about in the webinar, is that you don't have to be an expert gamer to facilitate the activities, and in fact, you can actually use that to your advantage. If you're not a gamer as a teacher, or you can find out what you don't know by asking and get the learners, or the teachers in this case, to tell you, to actually explain if there's a real sort of gap in knowledge, then there's a real communication opportunity for real communication going on. I think this idea, is one of the easiest way that teachers can be helped to bring this type of subject into their classroom.
Actually, that resonates with me in the webinar that I wanted to talk about, which is empowering teacher educators to introduce art-based translanguaging practices, because we sometimes maybe forget that learners bring so many skills and knowledge and experiences into the classroom, and that, like you said about gaming, we don't have to know everything about gaming. We can find out from our learners. And in this webinar, there was a similar idea in terms of interest in the arts, because they were bringing in artistic processes into the learning classroom, and also linguistic repertoire, so making the most of all the languages within the classroom. This particular project was going on in Vietnam, and there were several different local languages that learners had, and they used art and artistic processes within the classroom, including things like music, drama, visual arts, crafts. And they weren't using them just as activities, but as tools for communication. And we actually heard from from one of the teachers involved in the project, and she said that art created an emotional connection, and it boosted engagement, and it gave learners purposeful reasons to use their languages. So, and also the approach that the project used was teacher activity groups. So the model was that there were small peer-supported teacher-led groups, which is a very powerful professional development model, because teachers bring their challenges and ideas to the group and then discuss them and plan a way forward for any challenges or issues or decisions that they're going to make within their classrooms. So that was really interesting for me, that the approach with the teacher activity groups, which I think was a really powerful and helpful model, and also this idea that shifting away from learners as a deficit, they've got skills, they've got knowledge, let's use it. And then also the idea that the world has changed, basically, and we need to keep up with those changes. Multilingualism, working in diverse teams, use of technology, these are important and very current ways of working. And this webinar reminded me that if we want language learning to stay relevant, then approaches like this aren't optional extras. They're not just sounding nice and fun. They're actually necessary responses to the world that teachers and learners are already living in and preparing for.
I really enjoyed this session too. So the fact that looking at the whole person that sits in the class, so they were highlighting this, not just.
Yeah, and everyone just felt so energized by the approach. That really came across to me.
Yes.
That's always a good thing. That an approach energizes teachers, teacher educators. It's what we all need. We need renewed vigor and energy in our work, I think.
Oh, because they are using all their expressive resources, not just linguistic, but creativity, inclusion is there, critical language learning. So it's creating a nice challenge for the learners and also a nice atmosphere for them to be expressive. So because art, that's the purpose of art, maybe, you know, people express themselves in a more comfortable way. So using all those arts-based translanguaging to create meaning. So they explained in the presentation, they explained how they did that step by step, and they shared some resources actually. So yeah, can also be found in the webinar.
And also maybe the arts is where we have the edge over AI. Creative activities, we might be able to retain our domain.
You obviously haven't used AI to create images or write stories, Ellen. I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you.
Yeah, there are some really creative ways of using it. So I was trying to turn my son's the drawings into animations using AI. So it's about, yeah, actually how we use those images and how we actually guide learners about those creative experiences.
I like that idea of actually using your son's drawings rather than your son using AI to draw. I think taking it and then creating something additional out of what has been created that would otherwise be difficult or impossible to do is the way forward, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So thank you so much for your reflections on this. So let's see if there are any questions from our audience. So one question, as far as the arts language translanguage is concerned, how can a teacher maintain the movement of learners in a large class? Yeah, that's a very good question. That's one of the challenges, of course, having those activities. But how we see large class is maybe the starting point. If we see it as a challenge, then it becomes a challenge, but we can also see the benefit of having a diversity. And if we group our learners into groups, then they will bring different reflections to the class. So with the help of some tools we use, for example, assigning roles, giving time limits, some visible steps, clear instructions, and then we can manage that. So what about your thoughts?
Yeah, large classes are particularly difficult, I think, for teachers to manage. I think for me, my experience, I think helping teachers manage large classes very much depends on what is understood by large. So for one teacher, large may mean 30 students, another teacher, large may mean 200 students. And I think the approaches for managing those can be very different, I think. So I think as with a lot of teacher education, context and the details are so important. In other words, you have to start with that, doesn't it? And then it can be helped. What about you, Ellen? What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with what you've both said, and I think that having clear guidelines for learners, agreeing what the ground rules are, is also very important in large classes. You're going to be having, well, possibly you might use group work, so you need to understand the rules of and share the rules of working in groups. I also think something that's important after group work is to make sure that the teacher gives feedback on how groups have worked, because otherwise groups can think that's just a time to sort of waste time and not necessarily be on task. So good monitoring skills for going around the groups and checking that people are on task, eyes in the back of your head so that you can check that the kids behind you are still working on task. Those kind of things. As long as you as the teacher show that you care about what they're doing in the groups and recognize the effort that they are making within the groups, praise ways of working as well as the ideas that come out of group work. I think all those things can help mitigate the problems and challenges of a large class.
Very nice tips and suggestions, Ellen. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about this, how to grow eyes in the back of my head. I think that would help me quite a lot, Ellen. If you've got any tips of how you...
Or a 360 rotating head, that's the other alternative.
Are those two things that you've developed?
Oh, yes. Have you not?
Oh, wow. Not yet. Not yet. I've got a lot to learn, I think. But actually, seriously, I think one of the things I find is quite interesting is that idea of trying, whenever you're in a situation where you have group work going on as a teacher or a teacher educator, is to actually try to kind of do that changing position of where you're getting where your ears are getting the information from, rather than as a big set of noise as everybody's talking together. I suspect it's something that most, if not all, teachers and teacher educators actually learn how to do quite early on if you're doing group work, but it is something that you can develop, and it pays off if you spend some time doing that, I think.
I agree with you. For example, I had not tried jigsaw reading grouping until recently, and I really took the risk and I planned it so well. I took some time to plan it and to plan how I will, divide the roles, how I will bring the groups again, divide them again. And then I spent quite a long time to think about how I won't get confused. So I used a technique, used some colors. So I spent some time on my instructions as well. So it was like about, planning and being, again, purposeful and taking the risk and reflecting on it afterwards. Now I can try it again. So I think I'd like to encourage everyone to try and reflect, but also planning. A good planning helps.
I think also you said something interesting there as well, that you've tried something for the first time, or something that you kind of stayed away from. I think as teachers and teacher educators, we all do that. There are certain activities or things that a lot of people are kind of second nature to a lot of people in the classroom, that some of us, for whatever reason, haven't tried or don't want to try. We're nervous trying, even though they may well be pretty tried and tested activities, etc., or things to do, but you stay away from them for one reason or another. Or perhaps you tried something like that when you were starting out in your career and it didn't go so well, so you've stayed away from it. And I think one of the things we can always we should do today is to encourage all of our teacher educators or teachers, if there are teachers watching this, to actually try something new, and go back to our webinars to find out what that might be, if you like.
Definitely.
So we are coming towards the end of things. Let me just check to see if we have many questions. Our next and final set of webinars, perhaps we'll move directly on to those. So we have 3 webinars there, all about teacher development and system level insight. We've got preparing new teachers for real classrooms, challenges and solutions by Lorena. What do teachers around the world say about their professional lives? This was Ivana's take and summary of what was included in the Tallis report, the last Tallis report that was launched, and classroom observation and the CPD framework for teachers that was led by John Shackleton. I don't know, Shirin, Ellen, which of those webinars really caught your attention or interest?
Well, I was very impressed by the Preparing New Teachers for Real Classrooms webinar. What struck me was how complex the role of a novice teacher has become, or maybe it was always that difficult, but it just seemed to be so tricky. It was based on research from a Spanish master's programs, and it highlighted challenges that feel very universal and that come up time and time again in our questions. For example, the problems of classroom management, supporting diverse learners, constantly adapting to students' needs. So what I found interesting was how closely these findings matched what our participants in the webinars also stated as the issues they found challenging. And I think that one of the main things about this session was it reinforced the idea that preparing teachers today isn't about giving them ready-made solutions. The thing is, they'd had a whole year of preparation and a formal course that had supposedly prepared them for life in a classroom. But when they got in the classroom, things were unpredictable. And despite planning and preparation, they had to resort to other, things didn't go as planned. So I think the important thing here is that for novice teachers, we need to create support systems. And we've already talked about some of those support systems in the other webinars that we've discussed. So things like mentoring, things like learning how to do reflective practice and sharing with colleagues or with small peer groups, teacher activity groups. Those are the kinds of things that we can do to help teachers once they're in the field, at the chalk face, dealing with the unpredictability of being in a classroom. And another thing that struck me was that, giving authentic and varied training experience. So being able to do placements in a variety of schools, or also doing simulations where the students might play up so that teachers actually experience in a safe space the experience of things not going to plan. That could be quite a fun way of helping teachers to start to learn to think on their feet within the classroom. But I think the main thing that came out was that, there's a lot of teachers after their first year might leave the profession, and this is critical that we set up the support systems and the people around them to be able to support them, build their resilience, help them get through that first year, which we know is often so difficult, and really make the most of communities of teachers who can share solutions, can share lesson plans, can share a bit the workload. That was what I got out of that webinar. It's very interesting and useful, I thought, as a teacher educator, to ponder that particular problem of bridging theory and reality.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for your reflections. I think I don't think there'll be anyone who disagrees with that. One of the things you said when you first started talking about it is that has teaching become more difficult, and to a certain extent, I think there are more expectations and more the need for teachers to know more and to be aware of a lot more is definitely the case, and this, of course, makes it more challenging. I don't know what you think, Sharon.
Yeah, definitely. They mentioned also the reality shock. And yeah, this was interesting. So the gaps in classroom management skills and more practical opportunities to practice rather than just theory. So real examples with some more real examples, real role plays, longer school practice, school visits, collaborating with school teachers. So they need more practical experience. This is really missing in my context as well. So we all had these challenges. But yeah, these could be maybe handled. I mean, if there are pre-service teacher educators, they will find this webinar especially very useful. So that they can maybe take some takeaways and make some small adaptations in the way they prepare those students to make that link between what they have and how they can teach more effectively in real classrooms.
Yeah, the Talus report. Did either of you have anything else particular to say about what was discussed there?
Yes, so I actually want to comment on this. So, firstly, yes, the Talus report is Teaching and Learning International Survey. So it's a large-scale international study run by OECD that looks at teachers and school leaders' working conditions, learning environments. And Ivana Alexic, from the British Council, presented her analysis of this report. And what I learned from this webinar in particular is how Ivana interprets it, and her session was more about, I think, in addition to presenting, summarizing some of the key findings of Talus report under one key area. She also modeled how to interpret a large-scale report, so about data interpretation, because what we miss is that when we read a report, we should always remember the global context and the time it was written, for example, or the nature of the data sets before interpreting findings. Because what we discussed during the webinar was that this report was collected before the pandemic, so interpretations need to consider this limitation. Or whether it's now pre or post AI, it makes a big difference. For example, when we discussed one of the key themes, teachers' knowledge and skills required for teaching. So it makes a big difference whether the report was launched before AI or after AI or before post-pandemic. So in the report, we looked at teachers' knowledge and skills required, and the report findings you will find out in the report itself, and in Ivana's webinar also she shared that time spent on teaching is decreasing globally with increasing pressure from administrative tasks. And there is a gap in CPD, especially related to ICT and digital tools. So this was the case in 2018. Or teachers often work with multilingual learners, special educational needs, so they are not adequately prepared for mixed ability classrooms. And participation in professional development activities varies. Not all teachers have access to relevant support. And there is a need for more targeted and practical CPD. But for me, most importantly, the webinar highlighted the importance of data literacy, understanding how to read, question, interpret large data sets, and using data to identify global trends, but also not just learning them, but how to interpret them for local assumptions. And the fact that data must be interpreted critically and contextually, and by taking those current realities into consideration, such as pandemic, AI integration, or teachers changing roles.
Thanks, Sharon. And I think the final webinar also had as its core or its focus the idea of using research and the changes that have happened in teaching over the last 10 years, which led to the British Council CPD framework being revised and refreshed. And John Shackleton, we miss you, John, also used this as a way of talking about how things like the framework and the research that accompanied the new refreshed framework can be used by teacher educators to inform elements of our work. For example, in this case, this webinar John talked about how teachers, educators can use the CPD framework for teachers to inform teacher observation, providing feedback and suggesting areas of practice for teachers to develop upon. So this resource in the form of the framework can be something that can really help a teacher educator with something like observation. And John talked about how you can learn how to identify essential teaching attributes and skills by looking at how they're kind of referenced and presented within the materials around the framework. And I thought this was a necessary kind of supplement to the actual framework itself. So I really got a lot out of that. I think that brings us to the end of our review of the webinars. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, I think we're going to go on to just explain a little about. I said we were looking back, and now we're looking forward to what we've got planned for you for the next year. So we have 3 actual webinars planned for April, May, and June, and you can see on your screens the titles there. We're looking at talented and capable teachers and how to retain them. We're looking at narrative self-observation, and we're also looking at supporting multilingual learners through collaboration with science educators. And then we're very excited because we have done a call to all teacher educators on Teaching English to send in their abstracts to share with us sessions to be part of this webinar series. So from July through to March, we will have members of our audience become presenters who are teacher educators who are going to give us insights relating to the following areas. So we'll have 3 webinars on knowing the subject. We'll have 3 webinars in October to December on contributing to the profession. And from January to March, we'll have supporting remote learning. And we're very excited. We had very high quality submissions for the abstracts and proposals that came in from you all. And it was a very difficult choice to choose who was going to present, but you'll be hearing soon more about those, and we'll be adding those to our programme very soon. Shirin.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I also shared the link to our webinars in the chat. So these are all on Teaching English, so you can see the previous recordings. So once again, we would like to encourage you to watch those recordings again with your colleagues at school. You can reflect on these separately or by grouping them as we did and discussing on these. So we found it really helpful and useful for our own professional development as well. And finally, the recording of this webinar will also be available on our Teaching English in the next couple of days. And the link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive this week. And please share your feedback with us. You will see the feedback form in the chat. And don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter for teacher educators. And please register for our next webinar on 28th of April on how talented and capable teachers. So we very much hope to see you all again in our future sessions. Thank you so much, Ellen, once again, and thank you, Graham. So we look forward to having future review webinars together.
Thank you. Bye-bye.